The morning conversation stopped when I entered the lobby, not abruptly, that would have been too obvious. Instead, voices simply faded, like someone slowly turning down a radio. Heads turned with polite nods and forced smiles, the kind reserved for visiting relatives you're obligated to acknowledge but would rather avoid. "Morning, Mr. Merilnor," came the chorus of greetings, each one perfectly calibrated to sound respectful while carrying an undertone of dismissal. I'd built this company from nothing 26 years ago, but you wouldn't know it from the way my own employees treated me now. I made my way to the elevator, briefcase in hand, noting how conversations resumed the moment I passed. The familiar hum of office politics and project updates filled the air again, as if my presence had been nothing more than a temporary interruption. The elevator doors opened to reveal Eric, my son, already inside with 3 department heads. His voice carried that confident boom that had served him well in sales, but grated on me more each day. "So we'll bypass the usual review process. Time is money, and this client won't wait for bureaucracy." He looked up as I stepped in, his expression shifting to something that might have been annoyance if he'd been less careful about appearances. "Dad, perfect timing. We were just discussing the Morrison deal." His tone suggested I'd interrupted something important rather than joined a conversation about my own company's largest contract of the year. "The 10 million?" I asked, pressing the button for the executive floor. 10.2, actually. Arik's correction came with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Though I suppose the details aren't really your concern anymore. Varela and I have been handling the negotiations." One of the department heads, Janet from accounting, glanced between us uncomfortably. The other 2 studied their phones with sudden intensity. "I'd like to review the contract before—" "Already handled," Eric interrupted smoothly. "Standard terms, really. Nothing that requires your particular attention to detail." He paused, and I caught the meaningful look he exchanged with Janet. "Besides, your eyesight's been giving you trouble lately, hasn't it? Varela mentioned you've been squinting at documents." The elevator climbed in silence. I could feel the weight of unspoken conversations, decisions made in rooms I wasn't invited to anymore. When had I become a visitor in my own company? "The signing's tomorrow," Eric continued as we reached my floor. "Everything's arranged. Just need your signature to make it official." The doors opened, and I stepped out alone. Behind me, I heard Eric's voice resume its confident cadence as the elevator continued upward to what used to be my office. I stood in the hallway for a moment, adjusting my glasses. The prescription felt off somehow, like looking through water. Fine print blurred at the edges, making me squint exactly the way Eric had described. When had that started? I made my way to my current office, smaller than my old one, but still respectable, and found Mara Quinley at her desk outside my door. My executive assistant for the past 8 years, she was one of the few people who still treated me like the founder rather than a figurehead. "Good morning, Mr. Merilnor," she said, looking up from her computer. "Your calendar's been updated. The Morrison signing is confirmed for tomorrow at 10. "Any chance I could review the contract beforehand?" Mara's fingers paused over her keyboard. "I requested copies yesterday, but Mr. Eric's office said they'd send them directly to you. Haven't you received them?" I shook my head, and something flickered across her expression. Too quick to interpret, but definitely there. "I'll follow up," she said, making a note. "Though, I did hear Mrs. Varela mention that the documents were quite lengthy. She seemed concerned about the strain on your eyes." There it was again. My eyesight. When had everyone become so worried about my ability to read? I touched the bridge of my glasses, feeling the slight looseness I hadn't noticed before. "These do feel different lately." "Perhaps you should have them checked," Mara suggested gently. I nodded and headed into my office. My computer chimed with a new email. The subject line read, "Morrison Contract, a final review." I opened it, squinting at the text that seemed to swim slightly on the screen. "Dad, contract attached for tomorrow's signing. Standard terms as discussed. No need for extensive review. We've covered all the important points in our previous conversations. The clients are eager to close, so we'll keep the meeting brief and efficient. Just your signature required. Best, Eric P.S. Varela suggested having your glasses adjusted before the meeting. Might be wise." I stared at the postscript for a long moment. Varela had suggested it. My daughter-in-law, who joined the family 3 years ago and the company 2 years ago, was now concerned about my vision. I tried to open the contract attachment, but the file seemed corrupted. The text appeared as gibberish, symbols, and fragments that made no sense. I blinked hard and tried again, but the problem persisted. Another email arrived, this one from Varela herself. "Hi, Dad. Just wanted to confirm everything's set for tomorrow. The Morrison team specifically requested a streamlined process. They're impressed by our efficiency and don't want to bog down the signing with unnecessary delays. I've arranged for refreshments and a photographer to capture the moment. This deal will really put us on the map. Looking forward to celebrating afterward. Love, Varela. I leaned back in my chair, processing the careful language. Streamlined process. No unnecessary delays. Everything arranged without my input for a deal worth more than $10 million. My phone buzzed with a text from Varela. Optician appointment available at 3 p.m. today if you're interested. I could drive you. I stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Everyone was very concerned about my eyesight all of a sudden. Everyone wanted to help. I stood and walked to my office door. Mara, could you do me a favor? Of course. Could you try opening the Morrison contract on your computer? The file Eric sent seems to be corrupted on my end. She pulled up her email and clicked on the attachment. Her screen filled with clear, readable text, a standard contract template with all the usual clauses and terms. It opens fine for me, she said, then paused. Would you like me to print it? Please. As the printer hummed to life, I returned to my desk and picked up my glasses, holding them up to the light. The lenses looked normal, but something felt wrong. The weight was different, the focus slightly off. Mara appeared in my doorway with the printed contract. Here you go, though I have to say, the font is quite small. I took the pages and tried to read them, but the text blurred and wavered. Letters seemed to shift on the page, making comprehension nearly impossible. I looked up at Mara, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Is everything all right, Mr. Merilnor? I set the contract aside and removed my glasses, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Just tired, I think. Long week. But as Mara returned to her desk, I caught her glancing back at me through the glass. For just a moment, her carefully neutral expression slipped, revealing something that looked like concern, or perhaps pity. I spent the rest of the morning trying to work, but every document I attempted to read presented the same problem. Text that should have been clear was frustratingly illegible. By lunch, I had a headache that felt like a vice around my temples. The afternoon brought a parade of employees stopping by to wish me luck with tomorrow's signing. Each conversation felt rehearsed, as if they'd been coached on what to say. Such an exciting opportunity. Really puts the company on solid ground. You must be proud. But underneath their congratulations, I sensed something else. Relief, maybe. As if this signing represented more than just a business deal. As if it was the end of something. At 5 o'clock, I gathered my things and headed for the elevator. The building was emptying out, employees heading home to their families and evening routines. I should have felt satisfied watching the company I'd built humming along so efficiently. Instead, I felt like a stranger in my own creation. The elevator arrived, and I stepped inside alone. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Auric and Varela in the lobby, heads together in intense conversation. They looked up as the elevator moved, and for a split second, I saw something in their expressions that made my chest tighten. They looked like people who were waiting for something to end. The house felt different when I arrived home that evening, not physically. Everything was in its place, the same furniture and family photos that had decorated these rooms for years. But there was a quality to the silence that reminded me of the office lobby, conversations that stopped when I entered. I found Varela in the kitchen, preparing what looked like an elaborate dinner. She glanced up with a bright smile that seemed to require effort. Perfect timing. I thought we should have a nice meal before tomorrow's big day. She gestured to the spread of dishes covering the counter. Your favorite, pot roast with those little potatoes you like. It was thoughtful. Too thoughtful. We typically ordered takeout on weeknights, saving elaborate meals for weekends and special occasions. This felt like a performance. Where's Eric? Conference call with the Morrison team. Final details. She wiped her hands on a towel and moved closer, studying my face. You look tired. Are your eyes bothering you again? Again? As if this was an ongoing conversation we'd been having, though I couldn't remember discussing my vision with her before this week. Just a long day. I made that appointment with the optician, she said, pulling out her phone. 3 o'clock tomorrow, right after the signing. Dr. Kellerman comes highly recommended. Tomorrow's pretty busy. It'll only take an hour, she interrupted gently. And honestly, Dad, I'm worried. You've been squinting at everything lately, and with your age. She let the sentence hang, implying concerns she didn't need to voice. I sat at the kitchen table, watching her move around the space with easy familiarity. When had she become so comfortable taking charge of my schedule, my health, my life? Varela, can I ask you something? Of course. She didn't look up from the stove. When did you first notice problems with my eyesight? Now she paused, wooden spoon halfway to her mouth for tasting. Well, it's been gradual. Little things. You holding papers farther away, asking people to repeat things you'd normally read yourself. She turned to face me, her expression concerned. Why? Are you worried it's getting worse? I couldn't point to specific instances she was describing, but her tone suggested this was obvious to everyone. Had I been that oblivious to my own declining vision? Auric's voice carried from the home office down the hall, confident and animated, as he discussed contract terms with someone. His laugh echoed through the house, the sound of a man who was very much in control of his circumstances. He's been working so hard on this deal, Varela said, following my gaze toward the office. Really proving himself as a leader. The Morrison team specifically requested to work with him after that presentation he gave last month. I wasn't aware of any presentation. Oh. She looked genuinely surprised. I thought, well, maybe it slipped through the cracks. You've had so much on your plate lately. But I hadn't had much on my plate. That was the problem. My calendar had been increasingly light over the past few months, meetings that used to include me now happening without my knowledge. I'd assumed it was Eric taking initiative, shouldering more responsibility as he grew into his role. Now I wondered if it was something else entirely. Varela, who's been handling the day-to-day operations lately? Well, Eric, mostly, with input from the department heads, of course, and me, when it comes to client relations. She set down the spoon and gave me a careful look. Is something wrong? You seem, I don't know, distant lately. Distant. Another observation about my behavior that I hadn't made myself. I'm just trying to understand how we got to this point. A $10 million deal that I knew nothing about until this week. Dad. Her voice carried a note of gentle exasperation. We've been talking about Morrison Industries for months. Remember the dinner at Chez Laurent where Eric laid out the whole strategy? You said it sounded promising and told him to pursue it. I searched my memory for that dinner, that conversation. There had been so many business discussions over family meals, casual mentions of potential clients, and strategic directions. It was possible I'd given some general encouragement without realizing the scope of what Eric was planning. You're right, I said finally. I guess I didn't realize how far along things had progressed. Relief flickered across her features. That's what makes you such a good leader. You delegate well. You trust your team to execute while you focus on the bigger picture. But what bigger picture? I couldn't think of any major strategic initiatives I'd been working on lately. My days had been filled with routine administrative tasks and meetings that felt more ceremonial than substantive. Eric's voice grew louder from the office, and I caught fragments of his conversation. Absolutely. We can have that implemented by next quarter. My father's completely on board with the new direction. Streamlined decision-making process going forward. New direction. Streamlined decision-making. These weren't phrases that suggested I was focusing on any bigger picture. They suggested I was being removed from the picture entirely. Dinner's ready, Varela announced, but I was still listening to Aric's call. Transition should be seamless. He's ready to step back and let the next generation take over. I stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. Varela, what exactly is in this Morrison contract? Well, the basic terms, obviously. Service agreements, payment schedules, that sort of thing. She was arranging food on plates, not meeting my eyes. Eric could explain it better than I could. I'd like to see the contract tonight, before the signing. Of course. Though, she glanced toward the office where Eric's voice continued. He's been working on it all day, making final revisions. Maybe it would be better to wait until tomorrow when everything's finalized. Another delay. Another reason to wait, to trust, to let others handle the details. I'm going to ask him for a copy now. Dad, wait. Varela's voice stopped me at the kitchen doorway. I know this is hard. What's hard? Letting go. Trusting others to handle things you've always managed yourself. She moved closer, her expression sympathetic. But that's what good leaders do. They build teams they can rely on, then they step back and let those teams succeed. Her words made sense. They sounded like wisdom, like the natural evolution of a successful business owner. But they also sounded like justification for something that had already been decided without my input. Is that what I'm doing? Stepping back? Aren't you? She tilted her head, studying me. I mean, you've been talking about it for months. Reducing your day-to-day involvement, focusing on advisory roles, maybe even retirement in a few years. I had no memory of those conversations, but her certainty made me doubt my own recollection. Had I been planning to step back? Had I expressed interest in retirement? Eric's voice carried from the office again, wrapping up his call with promises to Finalize everything tomorrow morning. Moments later, he appeared in the kitchen, looking energized and satisfied. Perfect timing, he said, kissing Varella's cheek and clapping me on the shoulder. Just confirmed the final details with Morrison. They're thrilled with our proposal. I'd like to review the contract tonight, I said. His smile faltered slightly. Tonight? Dad, it's been a long day for all of us. Why don't we just enjoy dinner and tackle the paperwork fresh in the morning? I prefer to review contracts before I sign them. Of course, it's just... He exchanged a glance with Varela. The document's pretty dense, lots of technical language and legal clauses. And with your eyes bothering you lately? My eyes are fine. Are they? Auric's voice carried gentle concern. Because I noticed you struggling with the quarterly reports last week, and Varela mentioned you've been having trouble with small print. I looked between them, these two people who seemed to know more about my limitations than I did. When did you both become so concerned about my vision? We've always been concerned about your health, Varela said softly. We love you. We want to make sure you're not straining yourself unnecessarily. Eric nodded. Besides, this contract is really just a formality at this point. All the important decisions have been made. Tomorrow is just about making it official. What important decisions? The ones we discussed, he said, his patience clearly wearing thin. The service structure, the payment terms, the operational changes we'll need to implement. He paused. Dad, are you feeling all right? You seem confused about things we've covered multiple times. Confused. Another assessment of my mental state that I hadn't made myself. I excused myself from dinner and went to my home office, closing the door behind me. The room felt like a refuge, filled with books and papers and reminders of decisions I'd made when my judgment was unquestioned. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through recent emails, looking for the conversations Auric and Varela kept referencing. There were plenty of messages about the Morrison deal, but most were brief acknowledgments of updates rather than detailed discussions of strategy. My responses were consistently short. Sounds good. Let me know how it goes. Trust your judgment. Had I really been that disengaged, or had I been systematically excluded from meaningful participation while being made to feel like the choice was mine? I tried to remember the dinner at Chez Laurent that Varela had mentioned, but the memory remained frustratingly vague. There had been many dinners, many casual conversations about business. It would be easy to lose track of specific commitments made in passing. My computer chimed with a new email from Mara, sent from her personal account. Mr. Merilnor, I wanted to follow up on the Morrison contract. I've been trying to get copies from Mr. Eric's office all day, but they keep saying the document is still being finalized. Is there anything specific you'd like me to research about Morrison Industries before tomorrow's meeting? Best regards, Mara. I stared at the message, noting the unusual formality of her tone. Mara typically sent brief, efficient emails during business hours. This felt different, careful, almost coded. I typed a response. Please send me any background information you can find on Morrison Industries and their previous contracts with similar companies. Her reply came within minutes. I'll have a full report ready first thing tomorrow morning. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the sounds of dinner conversation drifting from the kitchen. Auric's voice dominated, animated and confident as he described his vision for the company's future. Varela asked thoughtful questions and offered encouraging responses. They sounded like partners planning a shared enterprise. They sounded like people who'd already made their decisions and were simply waiting for the formalities to be completed. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard in the elevator, Auric's comment about bypassing the usual review process. I thought about Varela's sudden concern for my eyesight and her insistence on scheduling an optician appointment immediately after the signing. I thought about the contract attachment that had appeared corrupted on my computer but opened perfectly for Mara. And I began to wonder if my growing sense of isolation was less about natural business evolution and more about careful orchestration. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable chill, the kind that makes you question whether you've dressed appropriately even when you know you have. I arrived at the office early, hoping to catch up on the Morrison research before the day's events began. Mara was already at her desk, a thick folder positioned prominently beside her computer. Good morning, Mr. Merilnor. I have that research you requested. I picked up the folder, noting its substantial weight. This is quite comprehensive. Morrison Industries is an interesting company, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Privately held, aggressive growth strategy, known for acquiring smaller firms and integrating their operations. She paused. They're particularly skilled at identifying companies with strong market positions, but transitional leadership. The phrase hung in the air between us. Transitional leadership. What does that mean exactly? Companies where the founder is stepping back or where there's some uncertainty about long-term direction. Morrison specializes in providing stability during those transitions. She met my eyes directly. They're very good at what they do. I opened the folder and tried to read the first page, but the text blurred and shifted just as it had yesterday. The frustration must have shown on my face because Mara leaned forward slightly. Would you like me to summarize the key points? Please. Morrison's typical contract structure involves a significant upfront payment in exchange for exclusive service agreements and operational consulting. They usually require streamlined decision-making authority to ensure efficient implementation of their recommendations. She glanced at her computer screen. The companies they work with often undergo substantial restructuring within the first year. What kind of restructuring? Leadership changes mostly. Updated management hierarchies, revised authority structures. They're very focused on what they call optimized governance. I set down the folder, my mind racing. Mara, have you seen the actual contract we're signing today? She shook her head. Mr. Eric's office has been handling all the documentation directly. Very confidential, apparently. Apparently. I was about to ask another question when Varela emerged from the elevator, looking polished and energetic. She spotted me through the glass wall and waved, then made her way to Mara's desk. Good morning. Ready for the big day? Her smile was radiant, but I noticed how her eyes quickly scanned the folder in my hands. What's all that? Background research on Morrison Industries, I said. Oh, how thorough of you. Though I hope you're not planning to spend the morning buried in paperwork. The signing's in just a few hours, and I thought we could grab coffee beforehand. Father-daughter bonding time. The phrase sounded rehearsed, as if she'd practiced it. Father-daughter bonding time before I signed a contract that might fundamentally change my role in my own company. I'd prefer to review... Dad. Her voice carried gentle reproach. You're overthinking this. Eric's handled every detail perfectly. The Morrison team specifically commented on his professionalism and thoroughness. She moved closer, lowering her voice. Besides, all that small print can't be good for your eyes. You were squinting terribly at dinner last night. Mara cleared her throat softly. Mrs. Merilnor, I have those copies you requested yesterday. Varela's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Copies? Of the correspondence regarding Mr. Merilnor's calendar changes. You asked me to print them out? Oh, right, thank you. Varela accepted a small stack of papers, but I caught the look that passed between her and Mara. It lasted only a second, but it felt significant. What calendar changes? I asked. Just some adjustments to make room for the signing, Varela said quickly. Mara's been so helpful coordinating everything. I looked at Mara, who was watching this exchange with careful attention. What kind of adjustments? Nothing major, Mara replied. Some meetings moved around, a few appointments rescheduled, standard preparation for a major contract signing. But her tone suggested there was more to it than that. Varela glanced at her watch. We should really get that coffee if we want to be back in time. The Morrison team will be here at 10 sharp. I found myself being gently but firmly guided away from Mara's desk, away from the research folder, away from any opportunity to dig deeper into the details that everyone else seemed to understand perfectly. The cafe across the street was nearly empty, the morning rush having subsided into the quieter rhythm of mid-morning. Varela chose a corner table, positioning herself so she could see the office building through the window. I have to say, I'm proud of how you're handling all this, she said, stirring sugar into her latte. Handling what? The transition. Letting Auric take the lead, trusting the next generation to guide the company forward. She smiled. It takes wisdom to know when to step back. There was that word again. Transition. As if my reduced role was part of some grand plan I'd agreed to. Varela, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Do you think I'm becoming incompetent? Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. What? No, of course not. Why would you ask that? Because everyone seems very concerned about my ability to read contracts, remember conversations, and make basic business decisions. Either I'm declining faster than I realize, or something else is happening. She set down her cup and reached across the table to touch my hand. Dad, you're not incompetent. You're just tired. You've been carrying the weight of this company for decades. It's natural to want some relief. But I don't remember asking for relief. Not explicitly, maybe, but actions speak louder than words, right? You've been delegating more, stepping back from day-to-day operations, encouraging Eric to take initiative. Her voice was gentle, reasonable. This Morrison deal is just the natural next step. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but she seemed genuinely convinced by her own words, as if she truly believed I had been orchestrating my own marginalization. What exactly happens after I sign this contract? Well, Morrison takes over the operational consulting, Auric implements their recommendations, and you get to focus on the bigger picture. Think of it as finally getting to be the visionary leader instead of the day-to-day manager. It sounded appealing when she put it that way. It also sounded like a polite way of describing my removal from meaningful authority. And if I decided I wasn't ready for that transition? Her smile faltered slightly. What do you mean? What if I wanted to postpone the signing? Take more time to review the terms, maybe consult with our legal team? Dad, she glanced out the window toward the office building. The Morrison team is flying in specifically for this meeting. Auric's been working on this for months. Everyone's expecting... She trailed off. Everyone's expecting what? For you to follow through on your commitments. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the company, the employees, the future we're all building together. The weight of obligation settled over me like a heavy coat. She was right, of course. Backing out now would be disruptive, embarrassing, potentially damaging to relationships Auric had spent months cultivating. But the alternative, signing a contract I hadn't properly reviewed for a deal I didn't fully understand, felt equally wrong. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it, expecting to see something from Eric about the meeting, but instead found a message from a number I didn't recognize. Dr. Kellerman's office confirming your 3 p.m. appointment today. Please bring your current glasses and any recent prescriptions. I showed the message to Varela. I didn't make this appointment. I made it for you, remember? I told you yesterday. She looked concerned. Dad, are you sure you're feeling all right? You seem to be forgetting things we discussed. I stared at the message, trying to remember our conversation from the night before. Had she mentioned making the appointment, or just suggested it? The details felt slippery, hard to pin down. Maybe I should cancel it. Focus on understanding this Morrison deal first. The appointment's right after the signing. Perfect timing, actually. She gathered her purse and stood. Come on, we should head back. Eric will want to do a final run-through before the Morrison team arrives. As we walked back across the street, I caught sight of Mara through the office windows. She was on the phone, taking notes with unusual intensity. When she spotted me through the glass, she held up one finger, a signal to wait, or perhaps to call her. But Virella was already guiding me toward the elevator, her hand light but persistent on my elbow. You know what I love about today? She said as the elevator climbed toward the executive floor. It's the beginning of a new chapter, for all of us. The elevator doors opened to reveal Eric waiting in the hallway, looking sharp in his best suit. His smile was confident, victorious even. Perfect timing, he said, embracing Virella and shaking my hand with firm enthusiasm. The Morrison team just confirmed they're 10 minutes out. Everything's ready. I'd still like to review the contract one more time, I said. Absolutely. I've got copies in the conference room. He gestured down the hallway. Though fair warning, it's pretty technical stuff. Legal language, operational specifications, that sort of thing. Might be easier if I just walk you through the key points. We entered the conference room, where a thick document waited at the head of the table. I sat down and reached for my glasses, but the text immediately blurred into incomprehensible shapes. I blinked hard and tried again, but the words seemed to shift and dance on the page. Frustrated, I looked up to find both Eric and Virella watching me with expressions of concern. Dad, Eric said gently, maybe we should just focus on the summary I prepared. All the essential points in plain language. I wanted to insist on reading the full contract myself, but the evidence of my failing vision was right there on the page. The text was genuinely illegible to me, while Eric and Virella seemed to have no trouble reading over my shoulder. Fine, I said, pushing the document away. Walk me through it. But as Auric began his explanation, I found myself thinking about Mara's urgent phone call and her careful questions about Morrison Industries. I thought about the research folder I'd barely had time to examine, and the optician appointment that had been made without my knowledge. Most of all, I thought about the strange timing of my vision problems, how they'd emerged just as this crucial contract needed to be signed. Eric's voice continued, confident and persuasive, describing terms and conditions that would reshape my company's future. But underneath his words, I heard something else. The sound of doors closing, one by one, until only one path remained. That afternoon, I sat in Dr. Kellerman's optometry office, staring at an eye chart that appeared perfectly clear. Every letter, from the largest at the top to the smallest at the bottom, was crisp and readable. Your vision is excellent for someone your age, Dr. Kellerman said, making notes on his tablet. In fact, these are the same prescription you've had for the past 3 years. No changes needed. I held up my glasses. But I've been having trouble reading small print lately. Text appears blurred, sometimes illegible. He took the glasses and examined them under a specialized magnifying device. After a moment, he looked up with a puzzled expression. "Mr. Merilnor, these aren't your prescription lenses." "What do you mean?" "The lenses in this frame are significantly weaker than what you need. It's as if someone replaced your proper lenses with ones meant for mild reading assistance." He handed them back to me. "Do you have any idea how this might have happened?" I thought about Varella's offer to have my glasses adjusted, her sudden concern about my eyesight, the convenient timing of my vision problems. "Can you tell when the lenses were changed?" "Hard to say exactly, but the mounting is recent. Within the past few days, I'd estimate." He pulled out a small case. "I happen to have your previous lenses here. We always keep them when we do adjustments. Would you like me to reinstall them?" "Please. And could I get a second pair made up, identical prescription?" "Of course, though it's unusual to need backup glasses so urgently." "Unusual circumstances," I said. 20 minutes later, I walked out of Dr. Kellerman's office with my original prescription restored and a spare pair of glasses in a discreet case. The world looked sharp again, text crisp and readable, but more importantly, I now had proof that my vision problems had been deliberately created. I sat in my car for a moment, processing the implications. Someone had switched my lenses to prevent me from reading the Morrison contract. Someone who had access to my glasses, knowledge of my habits, and a strong interest in ensuring I signed without proper review. My phone rang. Mara's name appeared on the screen. "Mr. Merilnor, I hope you don't mind me calling your personal number." "Not at all. What's going on?" "I wanted to follow up on something I overheard earlier today. It might be important." "Go ahead." "Mrs. Virella was on the phone this morning before you arrived. I couldn't help but overhear part of the conversation." Mara paused. "She was talking about your glasses. Specifically, she said something about the lenses being taken care of, and that you wouldn't be able to read the fine print." The cold feeling in my stomach intensified. "Did she mention anything else?" "She said the signing was just a formality at this point, and that you'd be stepping aside after the Morrison deal was finalized." Another pause. "Mr. Merilnor, I think you should know that there have been several meetings in the past few weeks that you weren't invited to. Meetings about company restructuring and leadership transitions." "Who was involved in these meetings?" "Mr. Auric, Mrs. Varela, and several department heads. Also some people I didn't recognize. I assume they were from Morrison Industries." I thanked Mara and ended the call, then sat in the parking lot processing what I'd learned. The lens switching wasn't a random act of sabotage. It was part of a coordinated plan to ensure I signed a contract without understanding its full implications. But if they'd gone to such lengths to prevent me from reading the document, what exactly was in it that they didn't want me to see? I drove to Hollis Dane's law office, a downtown firm that had handled my company's legal work for the past 15 years. Hollis was old school, methodical, thorough, and absolutely incorruptible. "Zane," he said, rising from behind his desk to shake my hand. "What brings you by? I thought you had a major contract signing today." "That's exactly what I want to discuss. Hollis, if I wanted to review the legal implications of a contract after signing it, what would be my options?" "Well, that depends on the specific terms. Most contracts have review periods, cancellation clauses, or amendment procedures built in." He gestured for me to sit. "But ideally, you'd review everything thoroughly before signing. Why?" I explained the situation, the Morrison deal, my reduced involvement in negotiations, the pressure to sign quickly without proper review. Hollis frowned. "Zane, you've never signed a major contract without having me review it first. What's different about this one?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." "Do you have a copy of the contract?" "That's been surprisingly difficult to obtain. Every time I ask, I'm told it's still being finalized or that the terms are too complex for me to review effectively." Hollis's frown deepened. "Red flags, my friend. Big red flags." He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "What authority do you currently have within the company? Are you still the primary signatory for major contracts?" "I assume so. Though now that you mention it, I'm not sure what my current legal standing is." "We need to verify that immediately." He turned to his computer and began pulling up corporate documents. "If someone's been making changes to your authority structure without your knowledge..." He trailed off, staring at his screen. "What is it?" "Zane, according to the most recent corporate filings, your role has been modified from Chief Executive Officer to Chairman Emeritus. The change was filed 3 weeks ago." "That's impossible. I never agreed to any such change." "The filing includes your signature on the necessary documents." He turned his monitor so I could see. There, on official letterhead, was my signature on a document titled Executive Transition and Authority Transfer. The signature looked authentic, though I had no memory of signing any such document. Hollis, I swear to you, I never signed this. I believe you, but legally this document transfers day-to-day operational authority to Eric while maintaining your position as titular head of the company. He scrolled down. It also establishes a framework for gradual transition of ownership and decision-making authority. Can this be reversed? Possibly, but it would require proving fraud or incompetence. And if you sign this Morrison contract as chairman emeritus rather than CEO, it might be interpreted as ratification of the authority transfer. I felt the walls closing in around me. Every step I'd been guided through over the past few weeks had been building toward this moment, the signing of a contract that would cement my reduced role and validate changes I'd never knowingly approved. What do you recommend? Don't sign anything until we've had a chance to review every document involved, and we need to understand exactly what the Morrison contract entails. He made more notes. Can you get me a copy? I'll try. But Hollis, what if they've planned for this contingency? What if refusing to sign creates more problems than it solves? Then we need to be smarter than they are. He looked up from his legal pad. Then Zane, if someone's been this systematic about maneuvering you into a corner, they've probably made mistakes along the way. Overconfidence breeds sloppiness. I left Hollis's office with a clearer understanding of my legal situation, but also with a growing sense of urgency. The Morrison signing was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and I still didn't know exactly what I'd be agreeing to, but I did know that my glasses had been deliberately sabotaged, my corporate authority had been secretly modified, and my own family had been systematically excluding me from decisions about my company's future. The question now was what to do with that knowledge. I drove to the bank where we maintained our corporate accounts, hoping to understand the financial implications of whatever I'd be signing tomorrow. Petra Solvik, our account manager, greeted me with professional warmth. Mr. Merilnor, what a coincidence. I was just reviewing the paperwork for tomorrow's transaction. What transaction? The Morrison Industries payment processing. Quite substantial. 10.2 million, as I understand it. She pulled up records on her computer. Though I have to say, the payment structure is unusual. How so? Typically, large service contracts involve periodic payments tied to deliverables. This one appears to be structured as a single upfront payment in exchange for comprehensive operational authority. She looked puzzled. Almost like an acquisition rather than a service agreement. A chill washed over me instantly. Petra, what exactly would Morrison be acquiring? According to the preliminary paperwork, operational control of your company's strategic direction, personnel decisions, and asset management. It's quite comprehensive. She scrolled through more documents. The payment would be made directly to your personal accounts rather than corporate accounts, which is also unusual. My personal accounts? Yes, as specified in the authority transfer documents filed last month. Since you're transitioning to Chairman Emeritus, the assumption is that this represents your compensation for stepping back from operational involvement. I stared at her screen, trying to process what she was telling me. The Morrison deal wasn't just a service contract, it was a buyout disguised as consulting agreement, and the payment would go directly to me, making it appear as if I'd voluntarily sold operational control of my own company. Petra, if I wanted to modify these payment instructions, what would that require? Written authorization from all parties, including Morrison Industries. Though given the timing, she glanced at her calendar. The transaction is scheduled to process immediately following tomorrow's contract signing. How immediately? Within hours, according to the instructions we received. I thanked Petra and left the bank with my head spinning. The scope of the deception was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Not only had they maneuvered me into signing away operational control of my company, they'd structured the payment to make it look like my idea. By tomorrow afternoon, I would be $10 million richer and effectively powerless within the company I'd built from nothing, unless I found a way to turn the tables. I spent the evening in my home office, carefully documenting everything I'd learned. The lens switching, the authority transfer, the true nature of the Morrison deal, the payment structure that would make me complicit in my own removal. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed a strategy that would expose the deception while protecting my interests and those of my employees. As I worked, I could hear Eric and Virella in the kitchen, their voices animated as they discussed tomorrow's events. They sounded like people celebrating a victory that hadn't quite been achieved yet. They sounded like people who had no idea they'd made a critical mistake. Because while they'd been focused on preventing me from reading the Morrison contract, they'd overlooked a crucial detail. I now knew exactly what they were planning, and I had nearly 12 hours to prepare my response. The game wasn't over yet. The morning of the signing arrived with an almost festive atmosphere in the office. I could see it the moment I stepped off the elevator. Employees moving with extra energy, conversations punctuated by excited laughter, the unmistakable buzz of a workplace anticipating significant change. Mara was at her desk early, as always, but today she looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Good morning, Mr. Merilnor. Ready for the big day?" As ready as I can be. I paused at her desk. "Mara, have you noticed anything unusual about the office atmosphere lately?" She glanced around the open workspace, where several employees were clustered in animated discussion. There's definitely excitement about the Morrison deal. People seem to think it represents a major step forward for the company. What kind of step forward? Growth opportunities, job security, modernized operations. She lowered her voice. Though I have to say, some of the conversations I've overheard suggest people believe there will be significant leadership changes as part of the deal. What kind of leadership changes? Before Mara could respond, Varela emerged from the elevator, practically glowing with excitement. She wore a sharp business suit I'd never seen before and carried herself with the confidence of someone about to achieve a long-sought goal. "Dad, perfect timing. The Morrison team just arrived and they're very impressed with our facilities." She beamed at me. "Eric's giving them the grand tour right now." Through the glass walls, I could see Eric leading a group of 3 people in expensive suits through the workspace. He gestured enthusiastically as he spoke, and the Morrison representatives nodded with the satisfied expressions of people seeing exactly what they'd expected. "They seem pleased," I observed. "More than pleased. They're talking about accelerating the implementation timeline." Varela's eyes sparkled. "This could be even bigger than we originally planned." "Implementation of what, exactly?" "The operational improvements, of course. Streamlined decision-making, updated management structures, enhanced efficiency protocols." She spoke as if these were concepts I should already understand. "Everything we discussed in the planning meetings." Those planning meetings I'd never attended, about changes I'd never agreed to. "Varela, I'd like to see the final contract before the signing begins." "Of course, though," she glanced at her watch. "We're running a bit behind schedule, and the Morrison team is eager to finalize everything. Maybe we could do the signing first, and then you could review the details afterward?" "I prefer to review first." "Dad." Her voice carried a note of gentle exasperation. "We've been over this. The contract is incredibly dense, full of legal terminology that would take hours to parse. And with your eyes," she gestured toward my glasses, "wouldn't it be easier to trust the team that's been working on this for months?" I touched my glasses, the ones with my correct prescription, though she had no way of knowing I'd had them fixed. "My eyes are fine this morning." "Are they? Because yesterday you were having trouble reading even simple documents." She moved closer, studying my face with apparent concern. "Maybe the strain of all this stress is affecting you more than you realize." It was a masterful performance. She seemed genuinely worried about my well-being while simultaneously undermining my confidence in my own capabilities. "I'd still like to try." Of course. I just want to make sure you're not pushing yourself too hard." She pulled out her phone. "Actually, I should check with Eric about timing. The Morrison team has a flight to catch this afternoon." As she stepped away to make her call, Mara leaned closer to my office door. "Mr. Merilnor, I've been monitoring the email traffic this morning. There's been quite a bit of correspondence about post-signing procedures." "What kind of procedures?" "Office reassignments, updated org charts, revised access permissions." She paused meaningfully. "And there's been discussion about a celebration lunch to honor your transition to advisory status." Advisory status. Another euphemism for my removal from meaningful authority. "Mara, I need you to do something for me." "Anything." "I want you to prepare a complete backup of all my files, emails, and corporate documents. Everything that demonstrates my ongoing authority and involvement in company operations." "Consider it done." She paused. "Should I be concerned about something?" "Just being cautious." Varela returned from her call, looking slightly less confident than before. "Small complication. The Morrison team is asking about some technical specifications that aren't covered in the standard contract." "What kind of specifications?" "Details about our current operational structure, employee contracts, intellectual property rights." She waved her hand dismissively. "Nothing that changes the fundamental agreement, but they want everything documented for their implementation planning." "That sounds like due diligence they should have completed before today." "Well, yes, but they're very thorough. It's actually a good sign. Shows they're serious about making this partnership work." She checked her watch again. "The thing is, gathering all that information could take hours. We might need to postpone the signing until this afternoon." I could see the calculation behind her suggestion. More delay, more pressure, more opportunities to wear down my resistance and push me towards signing without proper review. Actually, let's proceed as scheduled. I can review the contract now while Eric handles their technical questions. Virella's smile faltered slightly. Are you sure? I mean, if you're going to review the contract anyway, wouldn't it make sense to wait until all the details are finalized? I'm sure. She exchanged a meaningful glance with someone behind me. I turned to see Eric approaching, his tour apparently complete. Dad, great news. The Morrison team is so impressed they want to expand the scope of our agreement. His voice carried excitement, but his eyes held a different message. Though it does mean some additional complexity in the documentation. What kind of complexity? Enhanced operational authority, accelerated implementation timelines, expanded consulting scope. He gestured vaguely. All good things, but it means the contract is even more technical than before. I see. The thing is, they're really pushing for a quick turnaround. Their legal team is standing by to process everything today, but only if we can finalize the signing by noon. I looked between Auric and Virella, noting the coordinated nature of their pressure campaign. Technical complications that required immediate resolution, expanded scope that made review more difficult, artificial deadlines that discouraged careful consideration. What happens if we don't meet their noon deadline? Auric's expression grew serious. They move on to other opportunities. Dad, this is a once-in-a-lifetime deal, the kind of partnership that could set us up for decades, or the kind that could fundamentally change who controls this company. The words hung in the air between us. For a moment, the careful facade of family cooperation slipped, and I saw something else in their expressions. Not malice, exactly, but a cold determination that suggested they'd already moved beyond caring about my consent. Dad, Eric said carefully, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that I review the contract thoroughly before signing it. Novel concept, I know. Virella stepped forward, her voice taking on a tone of gentle reasonableness. Of course you should review it. We all want you to feel comfortable with the agreement. She paused. But maybe we should also consider the practical realities here. This deal represents financial security for everyone. You, us, all the employees who depend on this company. And if I'm not comfortable with the terms? Then we'll work together to address your concerns, Eric said. But Dad, at some point, you have to trust the people who've been living and breathing this deal for months. We're not trying to deceive you. We're trying to secure the company's future. His words sounded reasonable, even caring, but they also sounded like the closing argument of someone who'd already decided the outcome and was simply going through the motions of seeking consent. I understand, and I appreciate all the work you've put into this. I straightened my shoulders. Now, let's see that contract. The boardroom had been transformed for the occasion. Fresh flowers adorned the conference table. Bottles of expensive water sat at each place setting, and someone had arranged for professional lighting that made everything look crisp and important. A photographer waited discreetly in the corner, ready to capture what Virella had described as a historic moment. The Morrison team sat on one side of the table, 3 people in perfectly tailored suits who radiated the quiet confidence of those accustomed to getting their way. Across from them, Auric and Virella flanked my designated seat at the head of the table, positioning themselves as my advisors and advocates. The contract itself lay before me, a thick document bound in leather covers with colored tabs marking signature pages. It looked important and official, the kind of document that belonged in corporate archives alongside other milestone agreements. I settled into my chair and reached for my glasses, making a show of adjusting them carefully. Around the table, I could feel everyone watching, waiting to see if I would struggle with the text as I had in recent days. Instead, the words appeared crisp and clear. "Shall we begin?" asked the lead Morrison representative, a woman named Catherine Morrison who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to closing complex deals. "Absolutely," Eric replied. "Though perhaps we could start with a brief overview of the key terms, for everyone's benefit." I looked up from the contract. I'd prefer to read through it myself first. "Of course," Catherine said smoothly, though I should mention that we have some additional amendments that our legal team finalized this morning. Minor clarifications, really, but they do affect the implementation timeline. She slid a separate folder across the table. These supersede sections 12 through 18 of the main document. I opened the amendment folder and found myself looking at dense legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. References to operational integration protocols and authority transition frameworks. That could mean almost anything. "This is quite complex," I said. "Legal documents always are," Virella said sympathetically. "But the essential points are straightforward. Morrison provides consulting services, we implement their recommendations, and everyone benefits from improved efficiency. for $10 million. 10.2, actually, Catherine corrected, plus performance bonuses tied to successful implementation of our operational improvements. I continued reading, noting how the language carefully avoided specifying exactly what those operational improvements would entail. The contract granted Morrison broad authority to optimize organizational structure and enhance decision-making processes, without defining limits on those changes. I have some questions about the scope of authority being granted here. Perfectly reasonable, Eric said. Though perhaps we could address those after the initial signing. The Morrison team's schedule is quite tight. Catherine nodded. We're happy to clarify any concerns, but the fundamental structure is non-negotiable. Our methodology requires comprehensive implementation authority to be effective. I set down the contract and removed my glasses, cleaning them slowly while I considered my options. Around the table, I could feel tension building as my review stretched longer than anyone had anticipated. Mr. Merilnor, Catherine said gently, I want to assure you that this agreement represents the best possible outcome for your company. We've worked with dozens of firms in similar situations, and our track record speaks for itself. Similar situations. Transitional periods where founders are ready to step back and let professional management take over. Her smile was warm but predatory. It's a natural evolution for successful entrepreneurs. You've built something remarkable here, and now it's time to let others help it reach its full potential. The phrase echoed conversations I'd been having with Arik and Varela for weeks. Natural evolution, stepping back, letting others take over, as if my marginalization was part of some inevitable business life cycle rather than a carefully orchestrated campaign. And if I'm not ready to step back? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. Of course, that's entirely your choice, she said, though I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. We have other opportunities we're evaluating, and our resources are limited. How time-sensitive? We'd need to finalize everything today to move forward. If we can't reach agreement, we'll need to pursue other options. Eric leaned forward. Dad, this really is a unique opportunity. The kind of partnership that could secure everyone's future. Everyone's future, I repeated. Including mine? Especially yours, Varela said warmly. Think about it. Financial security, reduced stress, the freedom to focus on what you really enjoy instead of day-to-day operational headaches. She made it sound appealing, even generous, but I'd read enough of the contract to understand that my freedom would come at the cost of any meaningful control over the company I'd spent decades building. I put my glasses back on and returned to the document, reading more carefully now. Buried in the technical language, I found clauses that granted Morrison authority over personnel decisions, strategic direction, and asset allocation. The consulting agreement was essentially a management takeover disguised as professional services. I noticed there's no termination clause, I said. Our methodology requires long-term commitment to be effective, Catherine explained. Short-term engagements don't allow for meaningful organizational transformation. How long-term? The initial agreement runs for 5 years, with automatic renewal unless both parties agree to terminate. 5 years of Morrison control over my company, with renewal that required their consent. By the time the agreement expired, there might not be anything left for me to reclaim. I closed the contract and looked around the table at the faces watching me. Catherine and her team wore expressions of professional patience. Eric looked eager and slightly nervous. Varela's smile remained warm, but her eyes held a hardness I'd never noticed before. I'd like to take a brief recess to consider the terms, I said. Of course, Catherine replied, though as I mentioned, our timeline is quite constrained. How long do you need, Dad? Eric asked. 15 minutes should be sufficient. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below where normal business continued its everyday rhythm. People walking to meetings, making decisions, conducting their affairs without the weight of family betrayal and corporate manipulation. Behind me, I could hear whispered conversations as the Morrison team conferred with Arik and Varela. Words like resistance, concerns, and alternative approaches drifted across the room. When I turned back to the table, all conversation stopped. I have one more question, I said. Certainly, Catherine replied. What happens to employees who don't adapt well to your operational improvements? We work with everyone to help them succeed in the new structure, though naturally some positions may become redundant as we optimize efficiency. And what happens to executives who don't embrace the new management approach? We find that most leaders appreciate the opportunity to focus on their core strengths rather than administrative burdens. Her smile remained professional. Change can be challenging, but it's usually beneficial in the long run. I nodded and returned to my seat. Around the table, everyone waited for my decision. "I'm ready to proceed," I said. Relief flickered across multiple faces. Eric straightened in his chair, Virella's smile brightened, and Catherine reached for her pen. "Excellent," Catherine said. "If you could initial each page and sign at the designated spots." I picked up my pen and opened the contract to the first signature page, but instead of signing, I looked up at the faces around the table. Actually, I have one more document to review first. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a folder I'd prepared the night before. Just some additional terms I'd like to include in our agreement. The room went very quiet. "Additional terms?" Catherine asked carefully. "Standard protections for the existing management structure. Nothing that should conflict with your operational improvements." I opened my folder and began reading from the document inside, watching as comprehension dawned on the faces around me. The game was about to change. I set my folder on the table and looked directly at Catherine Morrison. "Before we proceed, I'd like to address a few discrepancies I've discovered in the documentation provided to me." The room fell into complete silence. Arik's confident smile faltered. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew the spare glasses case, opening it deliberately. "First, I'd like to clarify something about my ability to review contracts." I removed my glasses and put on the spare pair, then picked up the Morrison contract and began reading aloud, clearly and without hesitation. Section 12, subsection A. Upon execution of this agreement, Morrison Industries shall assume operational authority over all strategic decisions, personnel management, and asset allocation for the contracting entity. I looked up to find Eric and Virella staring at me in shock. Interesting language for a consulting agreement, don't you think? "Dad," Eric said carefully, "what are you doing?" "Reading the contract, something I was apparently not supposed to be able to do." I held up my original glasses. These lenses were deliberately altered to prevent me from reading fine print. Fortunately, Dr. Kellerman was able to restore my proper prescription yesterday afternoon. Virella's face had gone pale. That's impossible. Why would anyone—" "Mara," I called toward the door. "Could you join us, please?" My assistant entered the boardroom carrying a small recording device. "Mara overheard an interesting phone conversation yesterday morning," I continued. "Would you care to share what you heard?" Mara's voice was steady and professional. Mrs. Virella was on the phone discussing the lens replacement in Mr. Merilnor's glasses. She specifically mentioned that he wouldn't be able to read the fine print and that the signing was just a formality at this point. "The conversation was recorded," Mara added quietly, "as are all calls made from company phones, per our standard security protocols." I opened my folder and withdrew another document. This is a corporate filing dated 3 weeks ago, transferring my authority from CEO to Chairman Emeritus. A document I never signed, despite the apparent authenticity of my signature. Hollis Dane appeared in the doorway, briefcase in hand. That signature was obtained through fraudulent means. We have documentation proving the authority transfer was never properly executed. Eric shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. Dad, you're embarrassing yourself." "Petra Solvik from First National is waiting downstairs," I continued calmly. "Petra, could you join us?" Within minutes, our bank manager entered and consulted her tablet. The $10.2 million payment was arranged to go directly to Mr. Merilnor's personal accounts rather than corporate accounts. The structure is consistent with a buyout or acquisition rather than a service agreement. "A buyout," I repeated, looking around the table. "Not consulting services. A buyout disguised as a consulting agreement, with payment structured to make it appear I was voluntarily selling control of my own company." Catherine Morrison stood abruptly. "Mr. Merilnor, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding was mine. I trusted my family to act in the company's best interests." I stood and faced them directly. Instead, they orchestrated an elaborate deception to trick me into signing away everything I've built. "We were trying to help." Virella's voice broke. "Help!" I looked at her directly. "By sabotaging my glasses? By filing fraudulent corporate documents?" I opened my folder again. "Hollis, would you distribute copies?" My attorney handed out documents to everyone at the table. Catherine Morrison scanned the first page, her expression hardening. "This is a termination of negotiations," she said flatly. "Effective immediately." Catherine was already gathering her papers. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Merilnor. The meeting is over." The Morrison team filed out quickly, followed by Hollis and Petra. I found myself alone with Arik and Virella. The silence was crushing. "Dad," Eric said finally, his voice hollow, "we never meant—" "What you meant doesn't matter anymore." I gathered my papers. What you did is what matters. Varela was crying silently. I paused at the door and looked back at them one final time. This is still my company, and I'm not ready to fade away just yet. I walked out without waiting for a response. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft chime. In my briefcase, I carried the documents that would reshape the company's leadership structure. Through the glass walls, I could see employees at their desks, unaware that their company had just narrowly avoided a hostile takeover. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto afternoon sunlight, flooding the marble lobby. I stepped out, adjusted my glasses one final time, and walked toward the exit. The fine print, as it turned out, was worth reading after all.